So, I would like to introduce Professor Dominique Charpin, but of course he needs no introduction, I guess. But I will try and do small justice with his many feats. Professor of Mesopotamian Civilization at the Collège de France, corresponding member of the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres, pardon my French, director of the journal Revue d'Archaeologie, among other titles. He has written over 10 books and more than 200 scholarly articles. He is the master of the Old Babylonian period and has initiated the web portal Archibab, which aims to make all Old Babylonian archival texts accessible and has already catalogued tens of thousands of entries. He will now present new material on the clergy of Ur from the recent excavations at Tel Muqayyar, and by doing so, revisiting his classical work on this topic. Thank you, please.
So the right over to Let me begin with some personal recollections. My first visit to Ur was in 1974. You can see the original slide. I refrained to reframe it. When I was taking part for the first time to the archaeological mission at Lhasa, nearly 44 years ago, I was just 20, and my own work on the text of Ur began 4 years later. I was then working on my PhD, which was devoted to the Old Babylonian tablets excavated at Tel Sifr, ancient Kutalla, by Loftus in 1854, and then copied by Strassmayer in 1882, and again by Jean in 1931. I noticed that nearly 1/3 of the tablets had nothing to do with the rest. Research on their formulary and prosopography has enabled me to demonstrate they were written at Ur. But the question was then, how could they have been mixed with the tablets from Tel Sifr? Then I discovered that at the same time Loftus excavated at Tel Sifr, another Englishman, Taylor, was working at Tel Muqayyar. He discovered 30 tablets in what he called the Tombe Monde, which was later called EH site by Woolley. The tablets were sent to the British Museum and mixed with those Loftus discovered at the same time at Tel Sifr Kutalla. The second phase of my commitment with Ur was my thèse d'état, devoted to the clergy of Ur during the 18th century BCE. This work had been written in the same spirit as this colloquium, putting stress on the clergy as a social unit, analyzing its economic situation and its role in the cultural life of the time, especially as concerns education and the transmission of tradition to the next generation. And finally, in 2015, I received a mail from Elizabeth Stone inviting me as epigrapher to Ur, for which she received the authorization to make new excavations. You can imagine how excited I was. The site, 15 kilometers southwest from Nasiriyah, has not been looted in the last decades because a military camp is right next to it. It is completely enclosed and guarded night and day by the police. A rather comfortable house has been built within the site itself, ideal conditions for working and much better than those I experienced earlier at Lhasa. A first season took place in autumn 2015, which gave a few Old Babylonian tablets, a few Ur3 tablets, but above all, a batch of old Akkadian documents, about which I already reported during the Rencontre Archaeologique at Philadelphia in July 2016. When in November 2016 I received the invitation to participate to the present colloquium, which I accepted with great pleasure, I thought it could be interesting to update our knowledge about the clergy of Ur. But the next season, which took place in the spring of 2017, led to discoveries about the theme I had already chosen in a way I could not even hope for. We will first examine the question of the temple estate properties within the city of Ur. I will then review the evidence about the purification priests, the older ones being supplemented by new ones in 2017. Finally, we will re-examine the role of the clergy played in education, and here again, the 2017 season provided new evidence. In 1925-26, Woolley decided to extend his digging to the periphery of the sanctuary of Nana, the Ekeshnugal, to which his main efforts had been devoted during his first 4 seasons, and explored the sector called Tomb Mound by Taylor, to which he gave the name EH. During the next season, he extended his excavation to the west of the Neo-Babylonian temenos, a sector he called EM, where he found 16 houses. The tablets he found there allowed him to date the houses in the Old Babylonian period. In his final report, Woolley described the situation thus: "When we dug the EM area, we were surprised to find domestic buildings set up against and almost impinging on the sacred temenos. The buildings differ not at all from those in the AH quarter, but the tablets from them include a large proportion of religious texts, hymns, and so on, and it may be that the clergy attached to the main temples were lodged in houses set around the temenos and forming a sort of cathedral close. I wrote in my book on Le Clergé d'Ur that such a description was somewhat deceptive. It is true that a good proportion of the inhabitants of this quarter were priests of the neighboring temple, but they did not occupy what we could call today company housing. The buildings they lived in were their personal property, which they either bought or inherited and then transmitted to their heirs. But a text published in 1991 has shown that the Temple of Nana did own pieces of land in this quarter, which he eventually sold to private people. Was I wrong in 1986? The text belongs to the British Museum. It is dated the 2nd year of Rimsin I. The sale contract has some peculiarities, but the beginning is normal. The sold object is an unbuilt plot of 1 sar, that is to say 36 square meters. The neighbors are Imgorsin, a priest with the Sumerian title of Shita Esh III, and second neighbor Puzur Shamash. The owner is the Temple of Nana. The buyer is Puzur Shamash, obviously the neighbor. It is clear that Puzur Shamash bought from the temple an unbuilt plot next to his house, which he wanted to expand. Where does this take place within the city of Ur? Since the tablet comes from an acquisition in the British Museum, it's not evident. But there is a great luck. The neighbor Imgorsin Shita Esh is also known in a tablet found by Taylor in the Tomb Mound, and also dated in the 2nd year of Rimsin. The conclusion is rather clear. The tablet BM 13960, recorded in the British Museum in 1896, derives from illicit excavations made after the sounding of Taylor in the same part of the Tell. It is then sure that the Temple of Nana owned a house in a site next to the sanctuary. The problem is to know how the temple became owner of this plot and why it sold it. Let me remind you the surface, only 36 square meters. The simplest solution is to admit that the previous owner died without heir. In this case, the temple and not the municipality became owner of the land. So finally, my analysis of 1986 is still valid. The area next to the temple was made of houses belonging to private people, and it is only in special cases that the temple could own a house in that part of the city close to the sanctuary. And it sold it as soon as possible, the silver resulting from the sale entering the treasury of the temple, the Ganunmach, whose responsible, the Shatamu, sealed the document. We will now turn to a specific category of priests, which is particularly well known at Ur, the Abrig in Sumerian, Abrikum in Akkadian. In the EM site excavated by Woolley in 1926-27, the house number 7 Quiet Street is especially interesting. A family of purification priests lived there, Kuningal and his 5 sons. After the death of Kuningal in Rimsin 34, that is to say 1788, according to the middle chronology, 2 of his sons succeeded him and lived in the house for nearly half a century till it was destroyed after Samsuluna year 11. The main interest of the discovery was the mixture of archival texts published in Uit V and texts which has been described as religious and literary in Uit VI and school text in Uit VII. My book has been largely devoted to an edition and commentary of all these texts, reunited according to their fine spot. One of the most interesting texts in the archive is Uit V 191. A slave who belonged to Kuningal 20 years after his death redeems himself by giving another slave to the 5 sons of Kuningal, among which are 2 Abrikum priests named Eshulur Uru and Enamtisud. The seal of the letter has been impressed. Enamtisud, Abrikum purification priest of the god Enki of Eridu, son of Kuningal. In her book Nisabat 12, devoted to more Old Babylonian text from Woolley's excavation preserved in the British Museum, Gabriela Spada published the fragment number 6.2. She thought it was a similar contract, a contract similar to Uit V 191. Here are a copy and the photo on the CD, which is reproduced on the CDLI. But thanks to the project Ur Online, we can now access to a more comprehensive photo. You can see it is a fragment of an envelope. Then it is clear that this is the envelope of Uit V 191 with a variant in the name of the slave, which made Gabriela Spada think it was another text. So this is a little addition to something known long ago. Archival texts and literary texts found at number 7 Quiet Street had been published separately, but studying them together revealed fruitful. One can see how this family had spiritual traditions linked to the god Enki of Eridu, but it was included in the clergy of the moon god Nanasin in the main temple of Ur. There were also quite a number of school exercises. We will come back later to this issue. Kuningal's family was not isolated. There was at the same time at Ur at least another family of Abrikum purification priests. Its house has not been excavated by Woolley, but informations can be gathered from different sources. I discovered this family by chance at Yale, continuing my collations of the tablets published in YOS 12. On 2 tablets, not supposed to have been written at Ur, I deciphered impressions of one and the same seal belonging to an abricum named E Igidubi Isilim. This man was a witness in the contract Uit V 191 with the title of abricum. What is interesting is that in the legend of his seal, like the son of Kuningal, his complete title makes him an abricum of the god Enki of Eridu. Here again, we have a family tradition, because on the legend of the seal, we can see that the father was named Nana Adani, and this man was witness in an earlier document, TCL 1052, also with the title of Abrig. The Sumerian name of E Igidubi Isilim belongs to a special onomastic tradition. Members of the clergy bore a name which was a sort of short hymn to the glory of the temple they were attached to. Such names could eventually be shortened. An exercise discovered in house number 7 Quiet Street consisted to write such names and provide them with an Akkadian translation. The professor wanted to be sure that the students were able to understand Sumerian, which was, at that time, a dead language. The first name is E Igidubi Isilim, and this is not by chance. We can see that the third name is that of his colleague Eshulurbi Uru, one of the sons of Kuningal. I must add that in Uit V 191, the 5th witness, just after E Igidubi Isilim, is a man named Emeshudu, who also bore the title of abricum. Was he related to E Igidubi Isilim? We cannot say for the time being. Here, that there were 2 families who worked in parallel as abricum purification priests and had close ties, at least from the reign of Rimsin I to Samsu-Iluna 11, when the city was destroyed. The names of 2 purification priests from Ur appear on 3 tablets of OECT 15, published in 2005. They were bought by the Ashmolean Museum in 1922 and come very probably from Lhasa. These names were not properly identified by Stephanie Daly, who established the indexes and put them among the place names because they begin with the sign E2, house or temple. The first is our E Igidubi Isilim, and the second is Emeshudu, an abrig who was also witness in Uit V 191, as we have seen. The 3 texts where the names of these 2 abricum appear belong to the administrative archive of Shamash Razir, who had been made responsible for the royal domain in the region of Lhasa by Hammurabi. A book written by Baptiste Fiet about this archive will appear shortly. And then I arrived in 2017. One of the greatest achievements of Wule at Ur has been the exposure of the largest urban sector ever excavated, namely the AH quarter, southeast of the Great Temple. One of the goals of Elizabeth Stone was to dig at the periphery in order to get more information with the techniques nowadays available and thus supplement the studies made on the houses already discovered. The excavation of Area 3, on the top of this slide, began in the autumn 2015 and was carried on in the spring of 2017. A huge house was cleared. Some 30 tablets were discovered around the burial vault, which were related to a Babylonian general named Abissum. He arrived at Ur at least during year 36 of Hammurabi and is mostly attested during the reign of Samsu-Iluna till year 11. I reminded the excavators that it happened twice that Woolley also discovered tablets within the tombs. And this is what happened. Of course, the tomb was opened at the end of the excavation, and my problem was I was to take my plane. And finally, I decided to postpone my flight back. And I was right, because on Sunday, 5 tablets were discovered within the tomb, and on Monday, when I should have been in the plane to Paris, 7 more. Among them, tablet number 3229 is particularly interesting. This document records the fact that a loan of 4 shekels silver made to Wakara Bushu has been repaid by Abissum. What is of interest for us today is the name of the creditor. When I cleaned the tablet, I noticed that the name began with E2. So it was once more a member of the clergy with its funny names glorifying the temple. With more cleaning, I could read the complete name, Eigi Dubi Isilim. I already know this name. But the tablet, Uit V 191, where it was found, dated Rimsin 54, and this repayment was made in the reign of Samsuiluna, between 20 and 30 years later. So the question was, is this the same name or the same people? Then, with a better cleaning of the reverse of the tablet, I could decipher the seal legend. It was the same as on the YOS 12 tablets. Thus, I was sure I had to deal with the same man I met already 30 years ago. You can imagine how excited I was. The $100 I had to pay to change the date of my flight ticket was largely repaid. More seriously, this information was very important on many levels. First, it is a proof that these priests, who had close contacts with King Rimsin I and his family, were still in a good economic position even after the Babylonian conquest. And second, we also see that a priest of Ur had no problem to make transactions with Babylonian people installed in their city after Hammurabi's annexation, even with a high-ranking military officer. The image I had of these purification priests is thus somewhat modified. They were not a closed group mainly obsessed by the transmission of their peculiar traditions linked to the cult of the god Enki at Eridu, but they played as well a role in the socio-economical life of their city during the Babylonian domination. Let us move to the third and last part of this paper. For a long time, the role of the Mesopotamian clergy in matter of education has been matter of debates. Let us recall what Landsberger wrote in his provocative manner. One must castigate as false romanticism the conception of the so-called Priesterweisheit, priesterly wisdom, still to be found in secondary books. The scribes, although a great number of them were deeply religious, were completely a lay group. The priests, as well as the kings, not counting some exceptions among the latter, and the governors and the judges were illiterate. This great scholar was seriously mistaken on this point. Many discoveries show that the clergy not only mastered cuneiform writing, but that it was capable of writing new compositions and transmitting this knowledge of writing to apprentices. It is true that until the middle of the Old Babylonian period, the texts relevant to the liturgy, divination, and exorcisms are very rare, as Michalowski recently underlined. Unfortunately, the house of Urutu in Siparamnanum only preserved traces of the initial learning of cuneiform and not of the more advanced texts related to the training of a future chief lamentator, Kalamahum. For Uruk, the publication of Falkenstein and Cavigno has shown that alongside archival documents, a pit designated as Scherbenloch contained numerous fragments of school texts, which belong mostly to the stage of initiation, but also contain a good sample of Sumerian literature. The case of the clergy of Ur allows us to see again the important role writing played in the training of apprentices and in the transmission of traditions. Father Burroughs, who was the epigrapher at Ur in 1926-27 when Woolley excavated the EM quarter, wrote hesitantly about number 7 Quiet Street, perhaps ascribe a school. I will begin to recall shortly the conclusions I reached 32 years ago in my study of house number 7 Quiet Street. There is there no trace of the most elementary phase of learning, such as tutati or other syllabaries, but copies of lexical series and grammatical texts which were used to teach the Sumerian language. A number of lentils have been discovered, which were limited to a few lines, like this extract of MB to the king Lipit Eshtar, which was one of the first step as Tiftene Vanstipot, first of all, has established. A more difficult exercise consisted in copying Sumerian letters, either royal letters or letters belonging to the corpus recently called by Alexander Kleinemann Sumerian Epistolary Miscellanea. One of the tablets, on the tablet U7741, 6 letters have been copied, 2 of them being unattested elsewhere. 6 mathematical tablets have also been discovered, as well as an exercise for calculating the surface of a field. The copy of historical inscriptions belonged to the typical exercises an apprentice had to do. 3 inscriptions of the Akkad period and 3 of the Ur 3 kings were found, as well as a copy of Ur-Nammu's laws, 2 inscriptions of an Isin king and 3 of Lhasa kings. Further, Burroughs has been rather harsh with the students. I quote, "The copyist was guilty of gross errors, and then the scribe has made numerous errors, and in some cases the signs cannot be certainly recognized. And finally, the copy was made by an inexperienced hand." A good number of what is generally labeled literary texts has been discovered. Creation of the Who, Farmer's Almanac, Exaltation of Inanna, Hymn to Nippur, for instance. But what is the more interesting in this house is the presence of texts which have no parallels elsewhere. 5 hymns ending with the doxology Rimsin Lugalmu. I propose that some of them were composed ad hoc on the occasion of the visit of King Rimsin. Recently, Nicole Brish proposed it was a visit of Rimsin II, but I must say I'm not completely convinced. We have also hymns to the god Haya and to Nana. The latter has been summarized by Kramer in this way: an hitherto unknown hymn to Nana, according to which Enki plays a major role in the building of the Ekishnugal and its purification, as well as in its diverse rites, particularly those concerned with lustration and purgation. In my edition of the text, I explained this very curious situation. It was a way for the Abrig purification priests, devotee of Enki, to legitimize their presence in the sanctuary of Nana. They reproduced the words and deeds of their divine master, Enki of Eridu. In the same way, an Akkadian composition called by its first editor At the Cleaners is not a sketch from the life at Ur, but an exercise in Akkadian in which the god Enki is evoked as the patron of cleaners. I noticed yesterday that this aspect is to be added to my recent book on Mesopotamian temples. Here again, the results of the last season of excavations at Ur are very interesting. A new area has been excavated in 2017 by a German team directed by Adelaide Hotto, several hundred meters south from the AH quarter. The ruins of an old Babylonian house appeared immediately under the surface. The plan is still far from complete, but the residence was obviously large and well built. The texts have been discovered under the last level of occupation. The older ones belong to the reign of Iraimiti, and the latest ones to the reign of Tzili Adad in 1835. The texts have obviously been discarded while the house was inhabited by new people after 1835, so 1 century before the city of Ur was abandoned under Samsu-Iluna. The tablets, very often fragmentary, as well as sealed tags, have been found mixed with sherds, bones, and other waste currently being analyzed. Who was the inhabitant of that beautiful house? The leading figure is that of a man named Sinnada. The legend of his seal, after his name, bears 4 lines beginning with the indication that he is son of Igianakezu, scribe, intendant of the temple of the goddess Ningal. This seal has been impressed on clay tags which were used to close baskets of tablets, but also on letter envelopes, some fragments of which have been found. Normally, a letter is found in the house of the addressee. Logically, Sinnada could not be considered as an inhabitant of that house. But one of the letters was sent to a woman named Nutuptum. Sinnada begins his letter by a list of objects sent to her and adds that he will be back after 10 days. Nutuptum is then very probably Sinnada's wife, and the fact that Sinnada was the sender of this letter does not keep him from being considered as the house master. As I was looking closely to the impressions, all incomplete, of Sinnada's seal, I realized that the 5th line was not always the same. In some of them, Sinnada was described as servant of Sin Eribam, king of Larsa, between 1842 and 1841. In others, he appeared as servant of Tzili Adad, who was king of Larsa for only 9 months, in 1835. Sinnada felt the need to change his seal when Tzili Adad became king. His seal is, by the way, the only one presently known of someone describing himself as a servant of Tzili Adad. What is interesting is the fact that King Tzili Adad started work in the Ningal temple. This building was situated south of the ziggurat. So you can see Sinnada, intendant of the Ningal temple, succeeding in convincing King Tzili Adad to repair the building, but finally Tzili Adad had not enough time and the work was finished by Waratzim, who replaced him on the throne. But at that time, our Sinnada disappears. One of the most interesting aspects of Sinnada's house consists in the number of sculpted tablets discovered. Several lentils have been found, like this one. Thus, Sinnada was not only intendant of Ningal temple, he provided training to future scribes, and on his seal, he is still proud to have this title. This training was not limited to the elementary phase, since a new manuscript of the lament over Sumer and Ur has been discovered, identified by Anne Lehnert. 47 manuscripts were known till now, none of which bearing the complete text. Wulef found 13 at Ur, but none bore lines 251 to 267, very well preserved on the obverse of this tablet, which will allow Anne Lehnert to fill some gaps in the present edition. A fraction only of Sinnada's house has been excavated last year. The surface clearing has shown it covered a much bigger surface, which could give interesting new information during the next season. A short conclusion. Ur has given a rare opportunity to study the clergy in its topographical and sociological context. The combination of an archaeological and a philological approach aiming at an historical reconstruction as complete as possible was already rewarding in 1986, but it is now possible to learn more, and I was happy this morning to share with you the latest discovery. But what is of course striking is the fact that the new texts are better understood when brought together with the ones previously discovered. This is the reason why a new project was recently launched named Écriture, which is devoted to the old Babylonian text from Ur, deriving from all kinds of excavations, ancient and new. What I have presented to you this morning are the first fruits of this new undertaking. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dominique, for this wonderful presentation. What actually struck me most is the feeling that I got is it's something personal for you, like going back to your old home and revisiting it and seeing it in new eyes. It's incredible. Thank you. Any questions, please? A long time for discussion.
Just a short question, Dominique. Thank you very much for this wonderful paper. What does an abricum do as a priest, and what do we know about him, except the translation of the title?
Well, I can first of all say that this is precisely what we have not been asked to do in this colloquium, putting stress on the institutional, economical, sociological, intellectual aspects of the clergy more than on the real religious ones. But the fact is we are not so well informed. We have some economical texts in the house I did not discuss, where you can see some sort of offerings. And for instance, there is one which is very interesting, where you can see that all the doors of the sanctuary were given offerings of flour on the morning and on the evening. So clearly those priests had to take part to the opening of the temple in the morning and to the clothing before the night. And this is of course one reason why having a house close to the sanctuary was a good thing for them, because they had not in the morning to get up early and take the S-Bahn to go to the temple. This is something which is rather clear. They had also a role in all the purification matters, but I can guess also, for instance, where people were involved with swearing, they could take part. But for that, it's more an assumption. I don't have a direct evidence. And there are also, within the text we have, some kind of incantations, but again, we don't have the context except for the greeting of the king at the gate of the temple. So for their religious everyday life, unfortunately, we hope to have more than we do. And this, I think, has to do with the question of the transmission of the knowledge. I think that the most typical part of their religious tradition were not put in writing at the time. It was an oral transmission, and it is only later than people began to write down such things. And my impression is that it began in the later part of the Old Babylonian period, when people of the south were exiled in the north, and then suddenly had the feeling that their knowledge was something which was could be forgotten, and then they began to write things which were not written previously. And of course, this is frustrating for people working before this divide, but this is how I can explain why we know so few about the purely religious aspects of their activities.
Question out of ignorance. Does your evidence allow you to tell us very much about who owned the temple property, the sort of nature of proprietary rights in your context?
Yeah, for the temple itself, I could have discussed the ceilings of the people who were responsible of the treasury, and then you have a lot of different titles of people, especially you have the Shandabaku, who was responsible of the economy, but it was a kind of collective belonging, and then transmitted. Very often such offices were inherited, so you can see dynasties of Shandabaku or other responsibles, and I'm sure we will have later some papers about the prosopography of Uruk in the first millennium, for instance, where such phenomena are even better documented that it was in Ur. So this is why I didn't want I choose not to put accent about that, but we already see such phenomena at that time. So we have clearly to distinguish what we can say is a kind of collective belonging. In fact, it was the god who was considered as the owner, and it's interesting. For instance, in the land sale which I discussed, you see that it was from the god that it was bought. But the receipt of the silver was made by functionaries of the temple, because we don't have, for instance, a seal of the god, which could have happened, but it's not the case. They didn't make, I don't know, we know some seals of gods, but in other contexts, not for, as far as a seal of a god being used for economic transactions. What we have is Ashur seal, for instance, used on the vassal treaties, so-called vassal treaties of Saradon, but it's something else. For economic transactions, it's the functionaries of the temple who put their seals on the documents.
Conceivable that they were read by scribes, probably by priests. So some of the priests, they had to be literate.
Yeah. And this is the advantage of having the archaeological context of such texts, which is not so frequent, unfortunately, and we can then appreciate the difference between texts. I mean, the unprovenience texts, not to speak with legal or moral questions, that's something else, but they still have informations, but they lack such context as we can have in this case, and we can see how farther we can go in the interpretation of the text when we have the archaeological context. for the old Babylonian period, there is one letter of Samsuiluna where there are such problems, and so there is a trial which is made against same, and but I think there is more information in the Neo-Babylonian period, and so perhaps we will learn later about such things, although I don't know if our colleagues, specialists of the first millennium, will dare to put shame about the clergy of their period, but this is their responsibility.
Just a question also of the context. You talked about teaching in do we know where they did the teaching? I mean, they found the tablet, these literary tablets from the school tablets also in the house? Or?
Yeah, so of course, this is not a proof they taught at home, but this is the most probable.
It's their house. I mean, okay.
Yeah, and this is of course a kind of problem, because it's the same thing when you discover literary tablets. You have a tendency to speak of a library, because yeah, and you have a school, you have a library, and if you say, well, I have the house of someone with literary text or with school text, it's less, but in fact we have to pay attention. If we use the word school, this gives an institutional aspect which it didn't have at that time, and also normally a school is a building which is devoted all the day long to that, and we have to think about the learning of writing exactly in the same way as other professional transmissions. In my eyes, well, scribes trained other scribes in the same way. Carpenter had apprentices. All the transmission at that time was more or less made in the same way. So by seeing people doing, and by little being invited to make things from the more simple phase to more ambitious ones.
Just one clarification which I might have missed, if you can elaborate a bit on the tablets found in the tomb. I mean, the implication is not that it's Abishun's tomb.
Yeah, the question was...
No, I was asking regarding the tablets found in the tombs, and is the implication that this is his tomb, it's Abishun's tomb? I imagine not, but I wish to know why the tablets were deposited there. The other short issue is that the priest, as you have said, remains, although the change of rule during Hammurabi's time, this person entity to the Muslim. And should we expect a change of officialdom? I mean, I'm thinking of Mari, where, as far as I recall, some of the officials remain from the transition to Zimri. On the other hand, speaking closer to home, my home, at Emma, all the priests were changed once the Hittites arrived.
So I will begin by,
yeah,
I will begin by with your second question. Precisely, one of the problems was is there a continuum or not? And now the answer was already that there is a continuum, but now we have more evidence about that, because, as you said, both situations are evidence, and I don't think there is a rule about that. It's a question of circumstances and the political and sociological circumstances. And in the best case of continuity is, of course, the Babylonian under Achaemenian rule, where you see absolutely, if I can speak about first millennium, you don't. There is absolutely not immediately a divide. The divide comes after, but not when Cyrus entered Babylon. So this is now more clear. And about the tomb, in fact, as you can see, it was opened. This is a looting which happened just after the house was abandoned. in the time of Samsuiluna. And so it is clear that all the tablets were discovered all around, and some fell by chance within the tomb. And the chance is good for us because, of course, when the tablets were inside the tomb, they were much better preserved, and the most beautiful ones are the 12 which were discovered just at the end within the tomb. And I then checked the 2 other situations which had been dug by Woolley, and it is clear it is the same situation, which Woolley at the time did not understand very, very clearly. So this is also part of the new project to republish the archives which were found in tombs, and again, thanks to the Online Anglo-American Online project, we could find more information about the situation of tablets which were not recorded in the publication, but which are now known because of all the files of the expedition are now online, and we could add more evidence on these cases.
Just one last question. Are they doing also now a survey of the area around Ur and trying to find some relationship to the...
For the time being, what is being done has been a survey of the site itself with a drone. Emily Hammer did that last time, and for me it was something absolutely incredible when you have known Iraq at the time of Saddam Hussein, to have someone with a drone just beside a military camp and having absolutely no problem to work and making thousands of photos of the site. When I remember how happy Jean-Louis Huot was to have 3 aerial photos of Larsa taken by a photographer on a Hubschrauber, helicopter. Yeah, it's the same as in French, so that's the reason why the German word comes to my mind. And now you have all this mass of information. So this is the first thing, the site itself, which, especially in the spring when you have rains, you can see incredibly a lot of things. It's time, I'm
okay.
afraid.
Thank you very much.